Hey there YouTube, welcome back to the shop. This is part 2 of the Screamin' Eagle 114 Stage 4 engine rebuild kit. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe. So here are all of the new parts that we have: engine oil, transmission primary oil, rocker arms, rocker arm shafts, head bolts or head gaskets, base gaskets, pistons, oil pan gasket, camshaft, the correct bearing to go along with it, timing chain and timing gear assembly, the spacers for it and the bolts, push rods, lifter collars, bolts for the oil pan and cam cover assembly, and the oil cam cover assembly, and a cam plate, a new tensioner, hardware for that, lower and upper rocker box hardware, a left seal for the crankcase, cylinder studs. This gasket goes in between the engine and the transmission, and that's what seals off the oil passage. The latest and greatest Screamin' Eagle lifters in this vacuum jar. I've had a vacuum on it while I was unboxing all of this stuff to bleed all the air out of them. The latest and greatest Harley-Davidson water-cooled oil pump. And I think I said head bolts already. And this is a little plug that goes up in the engine case. And then we also have the engine case with the matching VIN number and the flywheels that are in there. I'm just going to keep that covered up while that engine case sealant starts to harden up a little bit. Yesterday we were on the bike, came through here, blew all the oil and dirt and debris that had built up under here. We did an initial cleaning on the transmission just to get all the big heavy pieces of metal off, because we want to get up down below and make sure everything's fully clean there, along with this passage and everything. So I'm going to cover up the new parts with plastic bag just like that, come back over here and do the rest of the cleaning on the transmission case, get the new oil pan on with the oil pan gasket, new hardware. Then we'll drop the engine case on into the frame, and then we'll move the bike back onto the normal hoist. I like pulling engines out on this hoist because it gives me the ability to use a flat jack and support things like this like I'm used to. But for doing the primary and putting the rest of the engine together, I like using the normal pole hoist. So there's gonna be lots of moving around and stuff, but here we go. Alright, it's come time to put our lower end back into the limited. The important thing that we're going to do here is there's 2 lower dowels on the transmission. We need to get the engine, like it'll slide in the frame and then kind of pivot down into those dowels. And we got to make sure that we don't damage the gasket that's in between the transmission and the engine, because that's what seals the oil passageway. And if something happens to that gasket, then we're going to be doing this all over again. So I'm going to post the camera up on the other side. Maybe you'll get a cool view. Maybe it won't come through. This area of my bay is real tough with lighting. Like it's super dark over there because there aren't any lights. You know, we're in a basement, and then there's a ton of light right here. So we're get the lower end over there, get a couple of bolts started, hopefully. Get the engine sandwiched up to the transmission the way that it's supposed to be. And then I'll lower the assembly down a little bit, get the front motor mount bolt through, Loctite all of those, torque them all down, and then move the bike over to the pole hoist. So let's get to going on that. So there's a pipe plug that doesn't come factory installed in the engine case. It's where you would put like a barbed fitting in for doing a oil cooled engine, but since this is a twin cooled or a water cooled, it doesn't have that. So obviously you want to make sure that you don't forget to put it in there. There's a little bit of lining up to do with the front motor mount. The way the little rubber bushing fits to like the metal piece, you want to be real careful with it, because if the rubber separates, it gets to be a real pain in the butt. It didn't happen in this situation, but I've done it before where you get a little bit anxious and you start rushing things and you don't give things the time that they really require and deserve. So we're just going slow. Got it, the whole front motor mount assembly put together, torqued it down. I always have to remember to put the kickstand on, because there have been situations where I'm just about to take the bike off the hoist, or I have, and I go to switch it over to the in-ground pole hoist, and I forget to put the kickstand on. It makes it real difficult. Now we're just putting in the new studs. It's pretty easy. You just use an old cylinder head bolt with a ball in it from like a ball bearing. I'm just running them in real quick with the electric ratchet and then torquing them down. I like to use the rear wheel to turn the engine over as I'm lining things up in the cam plate and when I go to put the pistons on. So that's where I like to do the primary and just put it all together. We're using this special tool to push the seal in. You don't really need the special tool. It's pretty elaborate. It's a really big and kind of heavy tool. For quite a long time, we had a damaged version where we just had like the collar that slid over the crankshaft and you just bop it in with a brass hammer and it worked great. But we ordered the actual correct tool, so that's what we're using. We're using the old stator. We just cleaned everything up, put it in. This is a special magnetic tool to help install the rotor so that it doesn't just like slam and slide in there. And then we're being real careful with pulling the inner primary seal off. Last thing you want to do is get crazy and get out in there and gouge something up. But I'm just tapping it around with the dead blow hammer, make sure it's fully seated. I like to do this with a dry seal. I've seen where people oil the outside of the seal first, and then I've also seen where those seals slide out, so that's just the way that I do it. You want to make sure that your starter is up and out of the way, and that you don't get it like jammed and bound up or anything. It's pretty easy. I just like to make sure that everything's fully seated and like the mating surfaces are touching before I start just running the bolts in and then trying to ask the bolts to do that, because that's an easy way to break things. But these bolts have a little rubber washer on the back of it, so you just shoot a little bit of oil on them, run them in, and then torque them down. Pretty easy. There's a couple dowel pins that are easy to fall out of the back of the primary that kind of help to locate the starter. So you want to make sure that you have both of your dowel pins in there, and then slide your starter in. It's easiest to do it if the seal is greased or oiled. Just FYI. So we're just going to compress the primary chain tensioner and then get the compensator and the clutch sprocket in there. I like to use just a zip tie, and I have everything cleaned up just to make it easier on the hands. But you just fully depress it, click a zip tie over it, and then when you go and bolt it in, before you fully like crank down the bolts, you have to cut the zip tie and pull it off, or else in certain situations it'll get caught up like on the back side of the primary, and then you can't get the zip tie out. But just making sure we have the springs on correctly for the compensator, everything's lined up, it's going together smoothly. Our bolts and nuts are clean. Loctite them appropriately. And then I'm going to torque them down. I like to just use a generic primary locking tool that I bought from Amazon, I think. But just toss it in there. That way we can fully tighten everything down. It's a pretty hefty torque, so you don't want to just like rely on the rear wheel or the rear brake being able to hold all of that. So you get the right tool, and they're cheap. I want to say that they're like $14 or something, so it's money well spent. Super easy. And then we're ready for our tensioner. You'll see I'll just run the bolts in very lightly, cut the zip tie off, and then I usually run the bolts in, torque it down, and then click the tensioner up to like a click or two, just with a flathead screwdriver. You don't have to, it will automatically do it, you know, when you're riding down the road. But I just like to have everything perfect, so the first time that I start the bike up, everything that I'm expecting here is sounding just the way that I'm expecting to. With the new hydraulic clutches, this throwout bearing can be kind of a pain in the butt, because once you pull it out, like the hydraulic slave cylinder fully extends, so you kind of have to like compress it as you're putting the snap ring back in. But just another thing to get used to with some of the newer models. We got the gasket surface all cleaned up. Toss a new gasket on there. And then I just Loctite all the bolts. I run them in lightly and then torque them down, and then I go back around them another full time, just like one after the other, just to make sure I didn't miss one. Just be 100% for sure. Usually I use my big red impact. Even though it has all of the power I could ever ask, it has a super smooth trigger on it. But for whatever reason, I felt like using the little electric ratchet. It's nice. It doesn't have a whole lot of power to it, So if you have a bolt that's being stubborn, it's gonna be a real pain in the butt to try to get it out with this little electric ratchet. And it's kind of slow, but it's super lightweight compared to my big dog, my 1/2 inch one. So this being a brand new engine case directly from the motor company, it came with a normal inner cam bearing for like a normal regular Milwaukee 8 setup. But again, this bike has the stage 4 kit on it, so it's supposed to have a full roller inner cam bearing. I could have done it earlier, but I'm just used to doing it in this type of setup, this type of setting, so I just waited till now. We just pulled it out. The tool that I used to pull it out is from SCREAMIN. And then the tool that I'm using to put it back in is from HARLEY. It's a normal dealership tool, but you can find them for $100 on eBay, pretty cheap. You just want to make sure that you don't run the cam bearing in too far. That's where I already have it marked out with green tape how far to roll it in. There is a specific way to go in and measure it. But to keep from doing that on every single Milwaukee 8 setup, that's just where we have taped it. Makes it easier and faster. I like to put heavy assembly lube on the O-rings for the cam plate and for the oil pump pickup, or the scavenge part of the oil pump. I just feel like they're that much less likely to fall out or move during the rest of this. Put some assembly lube on the cam. The lifter bores, obviously, you want to make sure everything's nice and lubed and well lubricated there. And it's super thick, messy stuff, so that's where I like to use it with gloves specifically, because, man, it's tough on your hands, like trying to wipe it off just because it's so thick. I like to use the thinner assembly lubricant on the oil pump. It's really good stuff. This type of assembly lube comes with the S&S oil pump. And luckily S&S sends a very fair amount of assembly lubes with those kits, so that's where I just have extra laying around. I like to put the oil pump in a little bit of like an assembly like this, so everything's all together. And then I use the rear wheel to rotate the engine over as I'm sliding the oil pump in, and it's lining up on the gerotors. And you'll feel it click in once for the first gerotor, and then click in again for the second gerotor. And then you'll push the oil pump into the scavenge seal that's in the engine case there. Just getting everything all set up, Loctited, and then lubricating the new cam plate. And then everything just slides and bolts right together. I like to run all the bolts in loosely for the cam plate, then torque them down, and then go back and then rotate the engine over as I'm tightening the oil pump bolts down. I feel like that gives it the best ability for the oil pump to center on the crankshaft, because the crankshaft is going to have run out. So That's what we always did with twin cams, and that gave us the best results. So it's just stuff that I carry over to the Milwaukee 8. And then we're just checking for shim height on the cam. You just put everything together without the chain. Toss your old bolts in for the crank and for the camshaft. Measure across the face of it with a 10/1000 feeler gauge. Pretty simple normal cam stuff. There isn't anything really complicated as far as setup. A lot of these parts are like Lego pieces. You pick one up, clean it up, put it in the engine, and then repeat. So we found the correct shim, put the chain on it. We're going to find new bolts that have Loctite on them, and then put them in there and torque them correctly. Then put the tensioner on. And then I like to lubricate the chain a little bit too. Like, I feel like it's going to be a while before the chain gets lubricant, and then it's going to be riding up against that tensioner there, essentially dry for a while. So I just put a little bit of assembly lube on it usually. That way it sticks on there long enough, like just good enough, so I can put the cam cover gasket on without it running down and running everywhere. But that's enough for this video. This is part 2 of the engine rebuild series. So come back, check for part 3. Like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.